Okay. John and Harlan and Elam are going to share about their 1W experience, which was alternative service during the their 1W experience was during the Vietnam War. And the question is, well, why this term 1W? Well, during World War II, the federal government's Selective Service Act provided for alternative service, and the Mennonite Church, along with the Church of the Brethren and the Quakers, worked out this arrangement where they would set up CPS camps, civilian public service camps, and the persons who were drafted who wanted to do alternative service would go to those camps, and they would do work that was considered to be a benefit to society. The early ones, they did things like do a lot of conservation work and stuff like that. And then toward the end of the war, it became a little bit broader, and we had young men go to mental hospitals and work as orderlies and so on in mental hospitals and so on. My friend Samuel Horst went out to California and worked as a fire watcher in the forest there in California. That was it sounded to me like sort of an interesting thing to do. But when the war came to an end, of course, the draft came to an end, but then it was reinstituted in 1950 when the United States got involved in the Korean War. Of course, that was a war to stop the advent of the North Korea, which was communist, overtaking South Korea, and we got involved in that. At first, under the draft law, COs, people who said we were conscientious objectors, were simply exempted. They weren't drafted. They were excused. But in 1951. As the war accelerated and there was more demand for soldiers, a new draft law was passed. And that draft law made a provision for conscientious objectors. And in the Selective Service law, there are different classifications, and they were given sort of abbreviations or numbers and so on. And the classification for COs was 1W. And so that would be what you were assigned. If you could convince them that you were sincere, they would give you a 1W classification. Both during World War II and the Korean War, and then of course during the Vietnam War, this was initially processed by a local draft board. And you went before this board. It was made up of local persons, and you had to convince them of your sincerity, and then they would grant you this status if you were able to convince them of that. I remember Nelson Baer telling me that the head of the draft board in Franklin County was a man by the name of Clyde Meadows, and he happened to be the pastor of King Street United Brethren Church, and he liked the Mennonites. And so he didn't give them any hard time in allowing them to have a 1W classification. Now, the difference between the 1W program and the CPS program was that the CPS program was an arrangement that the churches had with the federal government. The 1W program did not include the church at all. It was an arrangement between the draftee, his employer, and the federal government. And so the idea was that you would find employment that would be of service to the country. And so you had a lot of people going into things like hospital work and other things and so on. One of the interesting things that MCC started was the PAX program, which was an overseas program where people went and helped with rebuilding in Europe after World War II, and also then with development work and so on. Marvin Wadel's cousin, Mark Wadel, Harry Wadel's son, went to Germany and helped with that, with rebuilding in Germany for his 1W service. Now, there were problems with that arrangement because the church was completely out of the whole thing. And what you have happening is that what happened was that there would be hospitals that would say, yes, we will accept 1W workers. And people went, they made the arrangement, they got the approval, and they went there. And certain places were places where groups of Mennonite young men went. Some of them were married, and they would take their spouses with them, and so on. I know that Harlan's brother Sanford was married, and he went up to Maine to a hospital up there where a whole bunch of married young men went and did their 1W in the hospital up there. And I remember talking with Sanford about that. He says, really, it was a very good experience. They were all very serious people. They weren't trying to do anything they weren't supposed to. They had Sunday school on Sundays. There were preachers who came up and had church for them and so on. And it sounded like a very good thing. But there were other situations which were not good. And there were young men who fell into temptation and got into trouble and so on. So it was a mixed bag. At the same time, during the same time, the Mennonite Church was concerned about this whole program, and so they began developing what became known as voluntary service. And the fact that, Lance and Dylan and other people went to Faith Mission and so on in voluntary service all goes back to the experience in the 1940s and 50s where the Mennonite Church was developing these programs. And the idea there was that you would go and serve as a volunteer and help with, and you might do hospital work, okay, but you might do some other things too. And you would live in a household, you would have house parents, and there would be more oversight in it. And a minority of 1W men took that option because you didn't receive any wages. You received a little stipend and so on. But for a husband and a 1W man who had had a wife and so on, that wasn't as easy to do, as practical to do. But nonetheless, that is the whole background for all the VS programs you think about that our young people plug into. That's where it all originated. All right. Looking a little bit, so it started during the Korean War, which lasted between 1950 and 1954. Here in our area here, there were 24 young men who were drafted and had to serve in 1W. Out of about, there was a survey done in 1954, and at that time there were around 206 young men in Washington Franklin who were draft age. That meant that they could be drafted. So it's only a minority, only about a tenth of the young men who are actually drafted and inducted. Most of them could get farm deferments or some other kind of deferment. Okay. So after the Korean War was over, the draft continued. All right, they didn't stop the draft; they just continued it. But our country wasn't in a war, and so the number of people that they were drafting wasn't that large. So between 1954 and 1964, there were 41 young men who had to serve in 1W, and then in 1965, the United States got. They were involved in it a little bit earlier, but in '65, the United States involvement in Vietnam, there was a big push, and the federal government, military decided it needed to have more soldiers. And up to that time, they had been drafting around 17,000 men every month. In 1965, they started drafting 45,000 men every month, so almost 3 times as many men. So that increased the number of people who were being drafted, who were being inducted, and so that meant that more young men here in our area were called into that. Between 1965 and 1974, when the whole thing came to an end because the Korean War ended and the whole draft came to an end, there were 110 men who were drafted. and Harlan and John D. from our area were two of those 110 men. Elam, of course, was from Ohio. Okay, so that kind of gives you just a background of 1W and what it was all about. And John, you're up.
Well, I don't really feel I was very much a part of what Edsel described, because in 1964, I went to the university and I had a student deferment until 1966. Then I started teaching and I had a teaching deferment and I really never signed up to do 1W work. I did do 1W work then from 1971 to 1973. And that was because Christian Light wanted me to come and work for them. And I told them, I said, well, as soon as I step out of the classroom, I will be drafted. And so dear Aldine Brenneman went to Washington, D.C. and got a special provision for them to give me 1W credit. And John Hartzler likes to tell people, I am the only person who served my 1W at CLP. But I didn't go there to serve my 1W. I had to serve 1W because I went there, okay? So my case is a little bit different from some others. Now, at the end of my service there, I sent in my notice that I had completed my work at CLP, and they sent it back. The draft office was closed, the war was over, and I didn't even get any credit for what I did, I don't think, so I sort of don't fit the narrative very well. Now, before I talk about my work, my 1W work, I have to talk a little bit about CLP. And I thought I brought, I left it at home with, no, here it is. You might want to read the history sometime. I was right at the beginning of CLP. Sanford Shank, my wife's first cousin, had a vision from the time he got his degree at EMC to teach. He did his student teaching in public school and was horrified at the humanism that pervaded the public school textbooks. And so he had a vision of publishing Christian textbooks. Rod and Steph was already doing it, but he noticed that they were not doing anything about social studies. And that was the subject he felt was the most crucial. That's where most of the humanism was. And so he had a printing facility there. He was doing job printing like any printer. And he said, look, I have the equipment. He started to get some people together. They got a board together. Let's do this social studies project. Well, that was 1969. And then they did a couple little projects. They started Just for You. How many are familiar with Just for You? Okay. That was the first publication they had. And then they published Sanford Chetler's commentary on 1 Corinthians. They published the biography of Ryan Benner, Allegheny Gospel Trails. And then they were really looking for somebody to do this social studies project, and they didn't know who to ask. And so what happened was, I was teaching at Hartville Christian School, and I also was back at the beginning of the Christian Day School movement, the recent Christian Day School movement that started back in the 50s and 60s. And so there weren't many Christian day schools at that point, and I saw that it was really, really important for us to get our children out of the public school. I mean, I'd had enough experience with what was going on that I decided that I wanted to do all I could to do this. So in the Christmas of 1970, we had a 2-week vacation from teaching, and so I took a carload of people. It was 3 teachers and 3 students, and we traveled as far west as Kansas, as far south as Florida, and then came up along the coast promoting Christian day schools. Well, I was giving a talk to convince people they should have Christian day schools by contrasting a secular mentality about teaching social studies with a Christian mentality about teaching social studies. I didn't even know Christian Light existed. I did not know that Sanford Shank and Lloyd Hartzler, who were on the new board for CLP, were sitting in the audience at Raleigh Springs when I gave this talk. And they sat back there and said, there he is. Well, they didn't know how inexperienced I was. And I don't know what temerity possessed me to even accept their offer. But when I got back to Hartville, they called and asked if I would come and spearhead this project. And I said yes. When I got there, I wondered why in the world I ever said yes. In fact, I had a sign on my desk for a while that said, the secrecy of my job prevents me from knowing what I'm doing. And that was true. Well, I don't know about the secrecy part, but I certainly didn't know what I was doing. So I spent, and there was no committee. I mean, I was the first full-time employee of Christian Light Publications. Now, they had people writing these books that I told you about, but they were doing that at home and it was part-time. I was the first person that showed up to be a full-time worker at CLP. So I walked in to an empty desk. There wasn't anybody. I tried to ask, well, do you have any ideas? Nobody had given any thought as to how this project was going to be done. That was my responsibility. And it was sort of nice not to have a committee. Then I was free to do whatever. And so I spent the first 3 months studying how you write a curriculum. And in the meantime, I was the writer for everything that happened at CLP. I mean, newsletters, whatever needed to be written, whatever promotion landed on my desk. Sanford got the bright idea of doing a travel just for you that would be put in. He was a visionary, by the way. That would be put in all kinds of information centers along the highways. And of course, CLP had no money. That was another interesting thing about CLP. They had no money. They asked me to come and be a VSer, and I said, I can't do that. I have a car to maintain, and people were asking me to come give talks various places. So they paid me $60 a week. And I paid $40 of that for board per month anyway. People were nice to me. They boarded me around. There were a few places where Roger Berry and I lived together. We house sat a few places where people went off to do something and they let us live in their house. So that's what we did. So he came to me and he said, look, I have this huge job that I'm going to do, and there's this much space at the end of each sheet of paper that's going to be wasted. And it's going to be a 4-color job, which is expensive, and we can do this for free because this is going to go through the press for somebody else, and we're going to have this much space at the end. So that's why this thing folds this way rather than this way. And I had a lot of fun at CLP because there was a lot of that kind of thing happening. So I wrote this little travel brochure called Arrive Alive. Did anybody ever see this? They don't advertise it anymore, and they still sell hundreds of thousands of them per year. I mean, it was well, I made a real effort to make it really, really exciting to read. I mean, if you want to read it, I'll end it up here after the service, and you can look at it. You can decide if it's exciting. So anyway, they told me I was to plan the whole series, and I could write as many of the books as I wanted to write. Well, I planned the whole series, and I planned it basically after the public school system, which starts with community, social studies of community in 3rd grade. How many have ever seen this book? How many studied out of it? Oh, you studied out of it, Nancy. You taught it. I won't ask your opinion of it then. Anyway, so what do you do with community from a Christian standpoint? Well, what I did was I decided this would be a 3rd grade exposure to all the communities of Bible times. So the first unit was Egypt, Sinai, which is a nomadic, the Israelites had that, Palestine, and then Greece, the Greek culture. So that pretty well covers the cultures of the Bible on a 3rd grade level. And they were narratives, they were story characters that went exploring and did various things. And then the second unit, I wanted the students to have an experience. I wanted them to be exposed to communities where Christians have lived under certain circumstances. So the first one was Amsterdam, and it was about what a community does under persecution. The second one was Philadelphia, what a community does if they're colonizing. And the last one was Germany, what Christians do during war. And then I wrapped it up at the end by going back to Palestine, modern Israel, because each chapter had a section on how you should use resources. And so I talked about what was going on in Israel, how they were learning to have water to water the desert and what was happening. So that was this book. The interesting thing was we got it all written, and Sanford said, well, we need someone to lay it out, and we can't afford to hire anybody. So I had to do the layout too. He also said we didn't have enough money to do colored pictures. Now you must mind, remember, nobody knew about Christian Light. Nobody was making donations. They have lots of money now, but they didn't then. And so I said, well, what are we going to do about pictures? We don't have any money to buy pictures. Well, fortunately, I had been in Germany, and I had a nice amount of pictures of Germany. And I had been to Amsterdam, and I had pictures of Amsterdam. And I had been to Greece. I had pictures of Greece. So a lot of the pictures in this book came out of my own collection. And then I got this bright idea that I could go to the Library of Congress and everything there was free. So I went there for 2 weeks and I had a wonderful time. Learned to know all the librarians and they were all there to help me. And we, Sanford Shank came with his cameras and I had all these pictures lined up to take and he took all those home. And then he said, well, the problem is we can't do color. Color's too expensive. And I knew you had to put it through the press 4 times for color. I said, well, what's the cost? Well, he said the cost to separate the colors, which to print color, you have to separate the yellow, the red, and the blue and black, and then you run them, and the mixture of those makes all your colors. But you have to separate the colors and run it through 4 times. I said, well, what does a color separation cost? He said, $100. Well, in 1973, 72, that was very expensive. So I said, well, how big a picture will they do a color separation for? He said, poster size. Oh, I said, I have the solution. We'll paste all my little pictures on one poster. And so he said, okay, we can do 1/3 of the book color, 1/3 of the book 2 color, which that was the artist did a color separation and did overlays. They could do that cheaply. And then the rest was black and white. Then we went to print it. Well, now we're trying to save money. This is a really odd-sized book. And the reason for it is, I calculated how we could use every inch of the paper, these big sheets. So there could be 4 of them and 4 down. We could do 8 pages on one sheet, and I mean there was no wasted space. And so this book, when it was published, what they paid me, what they paid for the preparation, and what they paid for, I think, 2,000, I don't remember how many they ran. The total cost was $30,000. And they scrimped and saved to get that project finished. So that's basically all I have to say, just a minute here. Yeah, that's pretty well. Oh, the other thing, you notice this is manila colored paper. This is not white. And the reason for that is because some customer had ordered this paper to do the job that they wanted to do, and then when they went to print it, they didn't like the color, and they basically didn't use the paper. So the paper for this book was almost free, but it had to be manila colored. So that was my fun experience at CLP. And then it was my suggestion that every textbook we did would have a teacher's guide. And so then after the book was done, I had this thing to do. After I was back teaching at Hartville, I mean, I stayed there 2 years. As soon as my 1W was finished, I went back to Hartville to teach. And I spent the next year doing this teacher's guide. So anyway, I learned that I don't enjoy writing. I can do it. It's hard work for me. But that was my 1W experience. Being a person at CLP, spearheading a textbook movement. I also edited, I laid out the whole series, and then I was the general editor for Roger Berry's book, God's World, His Story, and James Lowry's book, North America is the Lord's. And then at that point, I told him, look, I helped you get started. I really don't, this is not my cup of tea. My sign still is true. I don't know what I'm doing. So Christian Light had to go on from there without me.
Well, my experience obviously was different than that. I filled out my application to be as a CO, and I didn't have to go to no draft board. And it was awarded just like that because I guess we had a good reputation in the community here, and but not everyone approved of it. How many of you remember Cassius Clay? He was a world champion boxer, and he filed as a CO. He got converted to Islam, and he spent 2 years in jail. But then he come back, and I think he boxed again. But anyways, there's a lot of strange people filed to be a CO. I would say, though, as a whole, the people, well, I should say where I went. I went to St. Joe's Hospital in Lancaster, which was a Catholic hospital. It was run by nuns. There was also the Lancaster General Hospital, which a good many people from this area went to also. And I'm not sure why I ended up at St. Joe or what, but I'm glad I did. And I learned to know people from different parts of the country. There's people there from this area. There was Brethren people, there was Brethren Christ, there was Mennonites. I think that's pretty much it. No. The Brethren Christ was Nelson Byers, who was killed by a bull. I learned to know him there, and he was a good fellow. And there was some from Iowa, some from Oregon, but the majority was from Pennsylvania and Maryland in this area somewhat. And most of them were honorable people, but there was those that weren't. They were CO in name, but I'm not sure how far that went. And I didn't have to struggle to be a CO. I know our church taught that, and I knew what it meant, and I just knew that's what I was going to do, and that's the way it was, would face someday. And I had three younger brothers, so a farm deferment was out of the question. If I would have tried, my dad didn't think it was even worth trying that. So that's where I went. I passed my physical, and so I had no excuse. And so I went there, and that's hospital work. We weren't called orderlies, we were called male attendants. Male attendants. That sounds, maybe that sounds a little better, but anyways. What we did, or what I did, or the male attendants took care of the needs of the male patients, basically. Also transported patients, and they had a psychiatric unit there too. And so there was always 2 male attendants there each shift. We had 3 shifts. I think I probably worked 2/3 of my time evening and night shifts. If you didn't complain about that, they would stick you there pretty much on the poor shifts. And I made $210, $220 an hour. And I made, and at that time, that wasn't ridiculously low, but today that sounds like peanuts. But, I made out and saved a little, believe it or not. Gas at that time was 30 cents a gallon, I think. And so everything in perspective, but we still had, and I might say, I grew up on a farm, and that was a good experience for me to go into that setting. If you grow up on a farm, you do things because you have to do them. You just get out and do it. If something has to be done, you do it. And that's the way it was in the hospital. I've done things there I never thought I would do. Taking care of men and male patients. We took care of them, and the nurses took care of the ladies. And so in that sense, it was a good preparation to be a farm boy. Although I did draw the line when I first went there. There was a doctor interviewed me about happening to do autopsies in the morgue. And I said, I don't think I'll go that far. And so I would have got paid more, but that wasn't worth it. And so I was a regular orderly. Some of the orderlies spent most of the time just transporting patients in the day shift. But as I said, I spent time in a psychiatric unit, and in the evening you would go around and find out what all was scheduled for the next day. Or you had to prep patients for procedures they needed to be done, the male patients needed to be done. And so the transportation, that was just very basic. That one didn't take much, I would say. Anyways. And so as I said, I got into a lot of things that I was assigned to do, but we just did it. You couldn't pick and choose, and so that's the way life is too. And so it was good to do that. And thinking of my father-in-law, Malin, was at the General Hospital. He got married right before we went, but that was several years before. But that's just and so he did janitorial work, I think. But I mean, I was happy for my experience there, but I was certainly glad when it was through. I was an outdoor person. I wasn't used to spending every day inside. And two, I'll say, I was thankful for my heritage. I was thankful for the church I usually was scheduled, usually he scheduled me, I'll say the supervisor of us was a gay man. His first contact with a gay person, but anyways, he was reasonable with it. I never had much contact with him, but I was saying, here's a Catholic hospital, and they have a gay man. And this is back in 69 through 71, you know, that was sort of strange at that time, but anyways. And they had a priest that lived there at the hospital, so he would be on call anytime anyone needed him. And he would come around passing out his communion for those who wanted it every day. And so I got to experience somewhat the Catholic culture was. And as a whole, I said there was a group of nuns that run the hospital. As a whole, they seemed like decent people, but there was some that seemed like they had their attitudes too, but you have that everywhere. And so, see, what was I going to say? As we went about our day-to-day life, I mean, there was things they taught us. They taught us CPR and all those kind of things. They taught us how to set up traction. We had people that needed that sometimes, and so, you know, it was useful while I was there, but not so much anymore. And so there was some training we got that was beneficial. It could be beneficial today if I ever needed it, but I probably forgot it because this was 55 years ago, and so I don't remember all those things. It's not clear. I remember a lot of names, or some of the names I should say, but as I thinking about what I had learned from that experience, I learned to be thankful for my health, for one thing, and I learned to be thankful for my mental health. I come away from there after being in psychiatric, the male attendants were there. This was like a short-term place. I mean, someone had real problems. They went on to the state hospital. These were, depression, schizophrenia, and whatever the terms are. They've changed some of them now. Those kind of people were there, and they had 3 different psychiatrists come in there and had their patients they're assigned to. And so they would counsel them and just prescribe medicines to them. But one thing always bothered me, they left God out of the picture. And today, it's still the same. They let God out of the picture. They let the spiritual dimension out of the picture, and it's all about psychoanalysis, whatever, figuring out these things, and prescribing a medicine, a drug, that will help them go through life coping with it. And so you got people that end up being, in a sense, a drug addict the rest of their life just to cope with life. And of course, it was a religious hospital. And so I know there's Christian people, plain people, that go down the same path. I'm not saying there's not a place for drugs sometimes, but boy, that's not the final answer. So God has not given us a fear, but a sound mind and power. And so rather than put that in the equation, it's just, well, the fathers of psychoanalysis, psychology, were atheists. And so that's why there's no God involved in that. And so that's one thing I learned from that in working there. And of course, if the people are trained that that's the way it's to be, they don't ask no questions, you just do it. And so, anyways, there was one interesting event took place. When you think of psychiatric, these were not wild patients. I mean, they coped. At nighttime, we had to make rounds every 15 minutes to make sure everyone was alive yet, and they weren't trying to commit suicide or something. And there was 2 of us on duty, and we couldn't sit beside each other. One sat down the hall this way, one this way, and every 15 minutes you made your round, and the nights got pretty long. And there was 2 nurses, I think, on duty. But that was the program at night. And I worked days sometimes and evenings sometimes. But one day, as I said, we all kinds of patients with their all kinds of reasons, and I'm not sure. But there was this young fellow there. I'm saying he was upper teens, 16, 18 maybe. And he'd been in here a couple times, and I think maybe this was the second time. And he was just a spoiled boy. I mean, but I'm just telling you what it leads to. Someone who wanted attention. Well, he come around this one day. He had a broken pop bottle that had this jagged point on it like this, and he had his hand wrapped in a towel holding this thing. And some of the nurses were gathered around. He come around this thing, trying to get attention, and all of a sudden he come to me like that. And I didn't think about what I should do. I just did. I brought my arm up quick like that, and the bottle flew. And then I had to subdue him. But anyways, I never felt bad about doing that. But that's the only time anything like that happened. But I'm just saying, he needed the Lord. He didn't need medication. And he needed to be trained when he was a child. I'm not sure what the family situation was. I think his mother was there at times with him, but it's just, and so when I think of my heritage, and I'm just so thankful for that. And as I said about my schedule, I usually work, I had 4 days off over a weekend, 4 days off, and I worked 8. And I always come home. And that was a blessing. I come home to the home church. Because things there, I don't know where it would have went. But there's some of them just, I guess were sowing their wild oats, but they were COs and 1Ws. And I'm glad I removed myself from a lot of those temptations I might have had. And I boarded with, there was 2 old Mennonite ladies, plain ladies, and there was 3 of us fellows there, and they were good fellows too. And I was thankful for that. There was a lot of good things for me in that life, in that situation. And so I understand it more now, what it means to be a CO. I do. I have had to grow in embracing that. I mean, I believed it then, but I believe it's stronger now, that we, I mean, I see the killing that's going on in the world, and it's awful. It is awful. I can't fathom it. Just because of greed and envy, and I don't know. It's just, and when I think that we have the opportunity to do that, to be a servant that way, not everyone, not all the male attendants were 1W boys, but a large majority of them were. And I'm thankful for that. And there's, as I said, some weren't, but some, as a whole, they were there, I think, being a good witness. And I prayed that I was too.
That went to church every Sunday. read the same scriptures that I just read, that did go to Vietnam. Sometimes I hear somebody say, well, why study Anabaptist history? Let's just be Christians. And I'm like, well, that's what these boys were. They grew up in a Baptist setting. They studied the Bible. They went to war. So I'm saying I appreciate Anabaptist history. It made, I can't appreciate enough that some brethren somewhere back in the 1500s decided that we need to take the scriptures literal. And we need to love our enemies. And we can't go and kill them. And so I'm saying, let's study Anabaptist history. Let's appreciate what has been brought to us through their convictions. I hope that going to all this fuss will be worth it. Thank you, Lance. I wrote a book about my life story, and one of the chapters was this. And I thought, well, rather than try to tell you, I would just like to show you that's the registration certificate and my name there. And let's see, I don't know how to run this. Just
It's supposed to be just right there.
these are some of the papers, I guess. I didn't know these were first. Statement of acceptability. I wonder if I'm doing something.
Sometimes it takes a while.
Okay.
Or you probably have to-
That one you can't read. An order to report for civilian work and statement of employment of employer. So I had chosen to go to Hagerstown, the Western Maryland Hospital. Selective Service System Notice of Classification. Elam Weaver is classified 1W, October 20, 1966. Well, I was to Carbon Hill and Bible school. There I met Thomas Crouch, who was teaching school in Maryland, Hagerstown. And he said there's some brothers down there that are starting a VS program, and they're looking for people, and he encouraged me to come down, so I did. This mansion here is located on North Potomac Street in Hagerstown, and it was a mansion. Really, really nice place. And they were going to start a VS unit there, and Thomas Crouch and I were the first two. And they were hoping to develop a larger group and be a witness there, sometimes go to street meetings and things like that in Hagerstown. And they had a real vision for it and wrote up handbooks and all. Thomas and I were the only ones that were ever there. So that didn't materialize. But just at that time, some of the brothers there was a division in the Washington Franklin Conference, and Mount Olive began. At that point, Mount Olive had the radio, and some of the brothers weren't really happy with that, and they wanted to start a church under the nationwide, well, it wasn't really nationwide at that point, but Paul Landis came up, and Roy Geigley was our bishop, and we had church meetings in this house here for a while before we built a church building out at Hewitt's. This is the Western Maryland State Hospital there, where I did my 1W.
What kind of
It was a state hospital. It was a long-term hospital where people came to die. And we took care of them until they died. And there is what I looked like, and there was our room. And it was a small room, and it had 6 patients in it, 3 on this side, 3 on the other side. And yeah, it was very, actually my father-in-law went to this hospital in his last days, maybe a month or so before he passed away. And I looked back into those rooms and I'm like, wow, they were really crowded. And then this is a certificate of release from civilian work. And after my 2 years were finished, I actually saved up vacation time, and I got out a couple weeks early because I was getting married. And that worked out well. And this is selective service classification. When you're all done, everything done, you're classified with 4W. You can see it there in the center.
You were how old then?
I was 21 in August, and I got finished in October. Well, actually, I was finished. We got married in September. I didn't really officially get this until October. That said date, August 2 of 1970. That's when they sent it. I don't know.
Was there any more?
Well, I had 12 pages. Yes. I thought you were going to do the whole thing. Oh, thank you, thank you.
I just took the pictures.
So when I turned 18 in August of 1965, just after graduating from high school, I was required to register with the draft board along with other young men. I don't recall just how it was, but apparently it was when I registered that I applied as a conscientious objector. In October, I received notice of my 1O classification, which was a conscientious objector, available for alternative service contributing to the maintenance of the national health, safety, or interest. Am I talking loud enough? So then in September, I received my order to report for civilian work. I had already decided to go to Hagerstown, Maryland, and I was in a quandary as to where I would go. But at Carbon Hill, I learned that some of the brothers in Hagerstown were starting a VS unit, and we're looking for young men. I actually started on October 5, and in 1966. And on the 20th, I received my 1W classification, which meant I was engaged in the civilian work. One can imagine that the transition from the farm to the hospital was a stretch, but I was not alone. There were German Baptist boys there: Owen Lehman, Stanley Boyd, Merle Jamison, Darrell Ridgway, Dennis Nacitello, Phil King, Wayne Philbrin. And there was a Seventh-day Adventist there, Harold Leatherman. And then there were several Mennonites: John Powell, Lloyd Brunk, Thomas Crouch, Stanley Shank. I remember the day that I left home with my 1963 Chevy, packed with the clothes and belongings, heading for Maryland. I'd been to Carbon Hill for 3 months, and I'd gone to Europe for 6 weeks. As a young adventurer, I left home probably not realizing too much what my parents and my younger sister Lydia Ann's feelings may have been. It was an impressive moment for me, but I don't feel I sensed the difference that this time I was never coming back to live at home. When I arrived in Maryland, the Morris Martin family became my closest contact. Grandpap, of course, later I married there. Grandpap took the most responsibility for me, and Uncle Silas was right behind him. Actually, Uncle Silas was the administrator for the new VS unit. The Friendship House was a luxurious mansion in its time and still very nice, with hardwood floors throughout and beautiful chandeliers and high ceilings and lots of space. Thomas Crouch and I turned out to be the only two who came, and toward the end of my 2 years, I stayed in Uncle Silas's basement and had meals with them. The hospital work was very interesting. Mrs. Nowell was our teacher, and we had sessions of training as to what is expected for hospital environment. I don't remember a lot of details. One memory is when she taught us how to wash our hands. You roll your thumbs in, and you don't let them stick out like this, as the tendency is, so that they don't get washed. Well, we all had to be passed on each duty before we were allowed to do it without supervision. We were shown how to bathe the patient, how to transfer them from the bed to the wheelchair, how to use the Hoyer lift, how to give an enema, how to dress the patient, how to make the bed, how to keep the reports. And she was old school and very strict on how things to be done. So we started out with one patient and worked up to maybe 5 or sometimes more, to bathe them, dress them, get them into their wheelchair, make their bed, and then put them all back to bed before going home. And that was a day's work. Another job we did sometimes was to go to the morgue and take a body from the refrigerator, place it on a stainless steel table for the doctor to do an autopsy, and then later go and return it to the fridge. One day, I was in King Fisher's room. It's a nickname. He was a black man, and we had a lot of fun with him, and was teasing him, and he began hollering out and cursing me. And I just reached over and I patted him on the mouth, and we often had fun with him, you know. And he hollered out, "Hey, he hit me!" And of course, the nurse was in the room, and she came right over. "Mr. Weaver, did you hit him?" Well, I guess technically I had. I didn't mean it. I mean, it was a light touch, but she said, "Well, I'll have to report you." So she reported me to the administrator. Administrator called me in and gave me a 3-day disciplinary leave. And I asked her if I could couple that with a weekend, and she said, "Okay." So I went home for a week. Very humbling. So, another job we did sometimes is, something's wrong here. Oh, next year, one day, they asked me if I would work the 12 to 8 shift. Start at midnight and go in the morning. Well, I'd never worked that shift. Well, that evening was a church meeting, the 3M, the beginning meetings of the Eastern Church. And Ivan Steinhauer was preaching that night, and I wanted to be there, and we all had a plan to go. Now, I guess we can be back by midnight. So that's the way it went. And we got back just in time. I think I clocked in a minute or two late. But anyhow, yeah, this page is out of order. So we went and got back and clocked in. So now I'm going to be up 24 hours, and it's the first time in my life for something like this. And I guess you could sit in the hall by the nurse's station and nap. They didn't really tell me that. But anyhow, mid-morning, I got desperately sleepy, and everything was quiet, and there were empty beds there. And I just laid down on one of them. Just take a little rest. And I was out like a house. I was going. And everything was quiet. "Mr. Weaver, wake up. What are you doing? You can't can't lay down on a bed. You come out here and sit on a chair in the hall. Okay. Once again, 3 days disciplinary action. Well, this time they had to report me to the draft board, and I think they sent me a warning letter. And I'm thinking, what kind of a guy am I? Sometimes I thought of the phrase in the Bible, and it came to pass. And it did pass. 2 years were going to be up in October. Anyhow, that chapter was over and a new one's beginning. This was a chronic disease state hospital where few people walked out of. There were patients with such severe arthritis that their bodies were completely stiff. I mean, and when you put them from the wheelchair, which they were kind of straight, and you put them in bed, oh, they just hollered with pain, and their joints just snapped like, it was like crunching paper almost. And it was really sort of difficult to see them and work with them. Then there were paraplegias, who were paralyzed from their waist down, and then there were quadriplegias, paralyzed from their neck down. Some of them were in turning frames. They would be laying on this frame, pipes, pipes with netting between where they laid on. And then you would take another pipe, just the same shape with the netting, and you would put it right over top of them, and it had sort of like a catcher's mask where their face would fit in. And then you would bolt this down, and you would put straps around it, and then you would just simply flip them over on their stomach and take the top off. And that had to be done every so many hours. I don't remember where the next page is here. Since they, I knew the one man for sure. It just happened when he dived into a swimming pool and his head hit something and it broke his neck, and from then on, he was in his frame. And it was just like, wow. And different ones had accidents and so on that were paralyzed, and they just had to do everything for them. Help them get a drink whenever they called for a drink. Some of them had cigarette holders on their end table, the bedside stand, and they had a hose that would go over, and you would put the hose in their mouth, and then you would put a cigarette in there and light it for them. And we're like, yeah, that's part of the job. But these hoses would get full of nicotine, and they just couldn't get what they needed, so you had to take a coat hanger and run it through them, and that that tar that came out of there was something. So anyhow, those are things that we did. Anytime there was BM on their sheets, you had to take it to the commode in the utility room and wash it out before you put it into the laundry. We didn't have rubber gloves. We had long-handled brushes. Many of the patients had sores, on their backs from bed sores. And the RNs came and changed their dressings. I never had seen anything like that. Some of them were several inches in diameter and really ugly. And there was a Mennonite nurse there that did a lot of that. I appreciated. Okay, let's see if there's any more here. Anyhow, that's probably pretty much the story. I'm sorry, it was sort of like it was. But where's my, oh, I left my paper here. And also, I had a book or so here. Oh, here, back here. Edsel said, now, what did you learn? Well, what did I learn? I learned not to hit anybody. I learned not to try to do more than what my body could handle, as far as sleep and so on. I learned some nursing skills, and you know, I very much appreciate them when it came to taking care of LMA. I think that God had prepared me for that through that. And like I said, I was a farm boy, pretty rough farm boy. Our home didn't have a lot of social, I don't know, refinement, let's say it that way maybe. I know one day I had a cold and I expectorated in the sink. Every room had a sink in it, and I just kind of expectorated there. The nurse said, "Mr. Weaver, don't expectorate in the sink." I'm like, you know, you just learn a little bit of refinement. Like, wait a minute, I'm not on the farm. Oh, yeah. One of the nurses, wasn't a nurse, but a nurse's aide, asked me one time if I would go out on a date with her. And she said, you know, I just don't like that black hat you wear. In Washington County, you know, I came to work with a black hat. So anyhow, I was like, thank you, Lord. You know, there wasn't a temptation to me. No way, you know. And some of the boys asked me if, Mr. Weaver, could I use your car tonight? And I'm like, well, we're supposed to, you know, when you asked, you know. And so I said, well, I guess, you know. So he came after work. He took me back to Friendship House, and then he took my car and went, whatever, you know. And then Uncle Silas learned about that, and he said, hey, wait a minute. You oughtn't to be doing that. You don't know what he's doing, your insurance, you're putting yourself at awful risk. And so I learned, hey, you need to use common sense sometimes along some of those lines too. And so I think I learned some maturity in those 2 years. And then I wanted to share that my friend Carl Wesley Good, my closest friend there in Chester, he thought he would like to have the different brothers from the Whistler Church setting there, Indiana and Ohio, to write their experiences in 1W. And so there's 70 brothers in here that wrote their stories. And he asked me to write my stories in there. And so here they are, and I think I know almost all of them. And yeah, that was a nice idea. And then in the Grace Press News, which I think I got here, and you probably got it too, I noticed on the back there, Armenia, it says, in a situation unrelated to the war in Ukraine, David, and I can't pronounce his name, of Armenia, is serving 2 years in prison for refusing to take the military oath In Armenia, all young men are required to do military service. No provision for alternative civilian service exists. While the appeals he submitted were being processed, he was able to move around freely. But then his appeals were rejected. David's church leader, Brother Alexander, wrote this report. After the court decision on the prison sentence remained unchanged, he was able to spend a little longer in freedom, and it was on the, August 20th, 24, that the police arrested him and took him to prison in some city there. On September 9, 2024, they transferred him to the prison camp in another place where he is currently being held. David has been treated well so far. Something may be brought to him every week. He may also have visitors twice a month, which indicates one short visit and a longer one. He calls sometimes so that we can keep in touch a little in that way. Please pray for him, that the Lord will help him to be a light in the darkness of prison. So I just thought, that's now. He's in prison right now. That sort of brings seriousness to our subject tonight. And then I looked up, and while I was in service in the hospital, and my friends, schoolmates, were in Vietnam. 58,220 American soldiers died in Vietnam. 58,000. And I took a neighbor, just lives between here and our place, took him home from the shop. And I noticed something about Vietnam in his back seat there or something. And I said something to him about that, and he said, yeah. He said, well, it wasn't Vietnam, it was Afghanistan. He said, yeah. He said, my only son was killed in Afghanistan. And I'm like, wow. I mean, could have been my son if we hadn't had civilian, you know what I'm saying? I mean, so as I think about it, wow. Some of our Christian forebears faced the sword, and they were killed. So would I be ready? Would I be ready to die for the Lord today? I mean, that's sort of what I think about. So that's all I have, and may the Lord bless.